Security Committee of Cabinet. I'm sure those watching at home have also been watching the extraordinary bravery and courage of the Australian Defence Forces as they've been enacting rescues, particularly across the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales. This is one of many acts of heroism and courage that we've seen, not just from our Defence Forces, but from our police, from our emergency services personnel, and of course by civilians themselves, as we've been encountering what has been an extraordinary weather event, a weather bomb as it's been referred to, in Queensland as it's making its way down the Australian east coast. There has been a series of extreme weather and flooding events which are continuing and will still continue for many days to come. Further storms, we've been advised by the BOM and Bureau of Meteorology, as well as other agencies this morning, and further flooding activity is expected throughout the week. And the peaks that we've seen, whether it's in Brisbane or other places, are expected to continue now for several days. Despite the terrible impacts that these flooding events have demonstrated, what we have seen, as I've just said, is extraordinary courage and response right across all agencies. That flooding event in Lismore has been without precedent almost. I mean, that is a part of New South Wales that is well used to floods. I know it well. And they have always been used to floods, but nothing like this in their lifetime. Breaching that levee bank and going and reaching into places that even long-time locals never expected to occur or to see in their lifetime. We're now seeing those flooding events follow their way down through Richmond and impacting on other settled areas. But this rather significant weather system we will continue to see moving down the east coast of Australia. We will see it come into the central coast and Sydney, and we're already experiencing elements of that right now, and particularly over the next 24 hours. We will then see that extend further into the south coast of New South Wales, and we need to be continuing to be preparing ourselves for the impacts in those regions. The advice also from the Bureau of Meteorology has been that we should also be aware of potential impacts even further south in East Gippsland and even in the north of Tasmania. The true courage and compassion that has been on display is of course heartening, and we thank everybody for their extraordinary efforts over these last few days. I particularly want to thank the ADF for their response. It has been swift and it has been comprehensive to meet all the requests that have been made by the states, and indeed in anticipation of those requests. Very early yesterday morning, I rang the Premier of New South Wales because of the situation in northern New South Wales and made those further offers, and I was very pleased to see them taken up, and we spoke further during the course of the day, including into last night as well. I've been very pleased with the way that state, local and Commonwealth agencies, Australian government agencies have been working closely together. Whether it's in Queensland, New South Wales, the agencies are very experienced in dealing with these issues, but the scale of these flood events and these weather events have come at a level which we haven't seen for some time. And as a result, they have adapted well to overcome the challenges that they're currently faced with. The ADF has some 600 personnel stood up or involved. Many and their rotary wing assets have been proving, as you can see on your own screens, incredibly important. And the weather situation, particularly in and around Lismore, as we were discussing this yesterday morning, was very difficult. It was not an easy thing to get those aerial assets in place to be effecting those rescues. So many of those rescues having to be undertaken by the flood boats. But those few rotary assets that were able to get into those areas have done an incredible job. Not just the ADF assets, but of course the Careflight and others and private assets that have been involved in the flood response effort. That will continue, and we are prepositioning further ADF support all along the eastern coast of Australia. That will range from Albatross down at Narra all the way up through, with assets coming down from Amberley to support all through the north coast and even down into the central coast. And we also have the assets out at Holsworthy, where the Black Hawks are, and able to assist should they be called upon to do so. 35 local government areas have been activated for disaster support. There have been already some 80,000 claims that have been made, and over $3 million already have gone out in payments directly through Services Australia to those affected, and that will be flowing at an even increasing rate over the course of the next 24 hours. In the case of the disaster recovery payment, which is a $1,000 payment for adults and $400 for each child, together with the disaster recovery allowance, which is an ongoing payment for up to 13 weeks for those whose income is interrupted, they are done 100% by the Australian government, and they were initiated even before, in some cases, the request was made by states and territories. We wanted to ensure that that support was in place. And the Services Australia teams are positioning themselves already and increasingly in evacuation centres to provide that support. And you are able to access the Services Australia support either on 1802266, or you can do it over the website, or in many cases in these evacuation centres there will be Services Australia support who can do that directly, and the mobile response teams from Services Australia are also being swung into action. Today, after a lot of response meetings that have been held over the last few days, the Emergency Management Australia and the National Disaster Recovery and Resilience Agency, led by Shane Stone, are holding a national coordinating mechanism meeting this afternoon with all states and territories, and are coordinating closely with the Australian Defence Forces. What does that mean? That is the group that looks at supply chains, that looks at impact on power, impacts on communications, impacts on key roads, all of these types of issues, and the planning is already underway for the recovery and the clean-up operations. When I was in Brisbane yesterday, had extensive discussions with the Lord Mayor and together with the Minister for Defence out at Enoggera. Their teams are ready to go and they're ready to move once those floodwaters start to drop. So I want to assure people, whether you're in Brisbane, whether you're up there in Maryborough or out in Gympie, or across northern New South Wales, or indeed those parts of the rest of the country are yet to be hit by these floods. At the same time as we're preparing the response to be there, we're already preparing, together with the state and local governments, the recovery and the clean-up operation, and assets are being pre-positioned and planning is underway for that purpose. I also note that the Treasurer and the Assistant Treasurer will be working closely with the banks and insurance companies. I've asked them to contact all the banks today and the insurance companies and be very clear to the insurance companies what our expectations are about their response, and I look forward to that being a positive response. And that means getting the assessors in. We've already started putting advanced assessors in from the Recovery and Resilience Agency to ensure that they can be assessing the impact on the ground, which enables further assessment of what's called Category D funding support for larger tasks that may be required to be addressed after flood events such as this. We are turning around the requests from the states immediately. And so when requests are made, I understand the New South Wales Premier was making some comments about Category D assistance. When we get some clear proposals about what is required, then they can expect us to turn those around. That's part of the discussion I've been having with Premier Perrottet, that we are dealing directly with each other and ensuring that those messages are being sent down through our various organisations to ensure a swift response. The other impact, which the Deputy PM in particular was raising today, and I share this view as does all the members of the NSC, and that is the impact on primary production. And we often see this in floods, just like we saw up in North Queensland, the terrible impact of floods on primary production. And particularly those dairy industries up in northern New South Wales, there will be the grisly task of carcass disposal and removal, which is challenging, and that is all part of the recovery and clean-up operation. But then the task will be to rebuild those dairy farms, to rebuild those dairy industries, just as we've been doing up in and around Taree after the floods there last year. So we have a very accomplished set of agencies that can move into all of these tasks.